Thank you all. Sometimes over the course of working in government and politics and policy, I get a real pleasure. And this is one of those moments because my friend Gary Samore and I have been doing this now for a long time, since the inception of UANI. And he's one of my great friends and fellow sort of policy travelers in this space, and just so well respected. And Gary and I laugh because all along we've been very close, and I never thought that, I think Gary and I have agreed on like perhaps 99% of things, and we disagreed slightly on the implementation of the JCPOA, and it was portrayed as a massive divorce in major international media. And I just wanted to say that I think that the reports of our divorce are greatly overstated, Gary. And who would have thought that our intimacy would be described in the New York Times? But it's a great moment for me to introduce Gary because he's so well respected, has served in multiple administrations, most recently in President Obama's administration on the National Security Council, and is really one of America's great experts in nuclear proliferation policy and the like. And now at the Harvard Belfer Center, and one of our advisory board members, but most importantly my friend, Gary Samore. And if you will, when we're done, after his remarks, we'll sit down to ask questions. We'll have people come through the crowd to get note cards to ask questions, and hopefully we'll have a good moderated discussion. So thank you again, and my friend Gary Samore.
Thanks very much, Mark. Really a great pleasure to be here. I always told Mark that that if there was a nuclear deal, the work of UANI would become even more important. And I think Mark has done a good job of trying to manage economic relations with Iran after the nuclear deal. So the topic of my discussion is the future of the Iran nuclear deal. As all of you know, the JCPOA has been in force for slightly more than 9 months since implementation day on January 16th. And I think it's far too early to predict with any confidence what the long-term viability of the agreement is, but I think we can see a pattern that's been established. So far, the deal has been transactional rather than transformational. Both sides have lived up to the letter of the agreement, but the spirit is very weak. The central quid pro quo of the JCPOA is nuclear restraints in exchange for sanctions relief. And as the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy, has verified, so far Iran has complied with the limits on its nuclear program specified in the JCPOA, concerning the size of its stockpile of low-enriched uranium and heavy water, limits on its development of a research reactor, centrifuge research and development, numbers of centrifuges, and so forth. According to the most recent IAEA report, a number of technical implementation issues have arisen, concerning, for example, some details about material accountancy and some of the provisions for monitoring centrifuge production, but nothing yet of any major technical significance. For their end of the bargain, the P5+1 have lifted the UN Security Council sanctions imposed because of Iran's nuclear program, and the US and the EU have lifted the nuclear-related sanctions regarding certain areas of trade, oil exports, and finances. As all of you know, the U.S. has kept in place secondary financial sanctions against Iran for money laundering and supporting terrorism, which include secondary sanctions against the Islamic Republic Revolutionary Guard, as well as limits on Iran's ability to use dollars or the U.S. financial system in any of their trade or exports. And partly as a result, the European banks have remained very cautious about investment and financing trade with Iran, and Iran has complained that it's not getting the benefits that it expected from the JCPOA. I understand that the JCPOA Joint Commission will be meeting this week in New York at the ministerial level in order to discuss some of these implementation issues, sanctions relief and nuclear restraints. Even if the central bargain of the JCPOA is fraying slightly at the edges, I think the two main players, the US and Iran, still have a very strong incentive to keep the deal in place for the time being. Or at least neither side wants to be blamed for being the one responsible for blowing the agreement up. For President Obama, the deal keeps the Iranian nuclear threat under control for the time being and allows Washington to focus on defeating the Islamic State on the battlefield, which I think is President Obama's top priority in the Middle East for the rest of his presidency. By the way, if the deal collapsed, it would complicate the tacit cooperation between the US and Iran in the fight to retake Mosul, and potential cooperation if the US-Russia deal on Syria holds, which doesn't look very likely, but if it did hold, the US would find itself tacitly working with Iran in Syria, just as we are in the case of Iraq. For President Rouhani, he has staked his political future in the run-up to the spring 2017 presidential elections on demonstrating that the nuclear deal will produce economic benefits for Iran. And for the time being, Iran is still very vulnerable to the reapplication of sanctions if the deal collapses, especially loss of market share in the oil market, which remains very soft, and the Iranians are just about back to where they were before its sanctions were imposed 5 years ago. They could lose that quite quickly if the deal falls apart and the Saudis and the Emiratis increase oil production. The most immediate uncertainty about the nuclear deal is the outcome of the US presidential elections. Mr. Trump has sharply criticized the JCPOA, and he's vowed to negotiate a better deal if he's elected. Hillary Clinton supports the agreement, but she's also emphasized the need to, quote, push back on Iran's regional aggression. If Mr. Trump is elected, I think he'll find little support among the P5+1 to reopen the nuclear deal. And of course, Iran will strongly resist less advantageous terms. Nonetheless, a Trump administration could work with Congress to impose new sanctions or reimpose sanctions on Iran in response to continuing actions outside the scope of the nuclear deal, whether it's support for Hezbollah, hostility to Israel, missile tests, and so forth. And Iran might respond to those sanctions by cutting back on its compliance with the nuclear terms of the deal, and one could imagine the whole arrangement unraveling. Even if Senator Clinton is elected, I expect that her efforts to reassure traditional allies and friends in the region, Israel, Saudi, UAE, I think will inevitably increase friction with Iran and put stress on the nuclear agreement. Assuming that the deal survives the immediate aftermath of the US presidential election, I think the longer-term question is really Iran's motivation to continue to comply with the deal, or to decide to cheat or renege on the agreement at some point in the future. As usual, there are conflicting theories. One theory is that the longer the agreement is in force, the stronger and more secure Iran will become, and therefore more likely to run the risk of cheating or even abrogating all or part of the agreement, if Tehran calculates that the US will not be able to mount an effective economic or military response. The opposite theory is that the more Iran benefits from the economic and political value of the agreement, the less likely it is that Iran will want to jeopardize those benefits by taking the risk of cheating or abrogating the agreement. In this view, Tehran might bide its time and wait for 15 years when most of the physical limits on Iran's enrichment program are lifted, and then Iran would be free under the agreement to resume its efforts to develop a nuclear weapons option. And presumably there will be advocates in Iran for both courses of action, and I don't think we can predict at this point which viewpoint will prevail. From an American standpoint, in many ways, the first scenario, that Iran cheats or breaks out of the deal at some point, is easier to deal with because I think we have a good chance of detecting any major violations and using the mechanisms of the JCPOA to reimpose sanctions and, if necessary, to justify military action. In some ways, the more difficult scenario, that Iran actually complies with the agreement of 15 years and then resumes its efforts to build an industrial scale enrichment program, may present a greater challenge for the U.S. to mobilize international support if we still think Iran is seeking to acquire nuclear weapons under the guise of a civilian enrichment program. But at this point, I don't have much confidence that the deal is going to survive 15 years because it remains hostage to the very deep and broad underlying suspicion and hostility between Washington and Tehran. And the deal's become enmeshed in the domestic politics in both countries. Supreme Leader Khamenei over and over again has emphasized that the nuclear deal doesn't change Iran's overall orientation as a revolutionary power hostile to the U.S. and U.S. allies. And therefore, I think we can expect that for the time being, just like before the nuclear deal, Iran will test ballistic missiles, support Hezbollah and Hamas and Assad, call for the elimination of Israel, harass U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf, criticize the Saudis, stir up trouble in the Arabian Peninsula, and so forth. And any one of these disputes can escalate and undercut political support for the agreement in Washington or in Tehran. So to conclude, so far the deal has achieved what it was designed to accomplish. It's limited Iran's capacity to produce fissile material in exchange for limited sanctions relief. But whether the deal can survive in the longer term, I think remains very uncertain, at least as long as Supreme Leader Khamenei remains in charge of Iran's foreign policy. Thanks very much. I'm very happy to have a conversation with my friend Mark and then take your questions.
Thank you, Gary, very much. I know our team is going through the room, and if you have any questions, please let our team know. We'll flag a few. But let me start with the prerogative of being part of UANI. Let's talk about Iran's behavior and violations of the agreement. You and I have talked about those in the past. And I want to frame it, I think you did in your remarks, technical and major violations. Do technical violations, should we track them? Should we hold them accountable to them? I mean, in my opinion, there have been a few technical violations already, probably not too substantive. I think you probably agree with that. How do we deal with the technical part of it? Because we probably don't want to give them a free pass, but we probably wouldn't want to say the agreement is breached. So how do you deal with there's too much enriched uranium on hand, or there are some other technical violations that somehow technically violate the agreement? How do you propose to deal with those?
So I think it's a good question, because if there are violations, they're most likely, at least in the beginning, to be minor and technical. And I don't think you can just let them pass by. I think the purpose of the Joint Commission is to raise concerns, just like Iran raises concerns about sanctions relief. If we have issues, we should raise them about nuclear compliance. And to be fair, the agreement does have some ambiguities in it. For example, one of the current technical issues that's being discussed is how to count some of Iran's low-enriched uranium, which is stuck in the pipes of a conversion facility. And we argue that that low-enriched uranium should count against the cap of 300 kilograms the Iranians argue that since they don't have access to it, it shouldn't count against those caps. So I think that's an area where there's ambiguity, and it's better for the sides to try to work that out. If there was a major violation, which again I don't think is likely in the near term, although I wouldn't rule it out in the out years, then I think you can use the mechanisms in the JCPOA to threaten to reimpose sanctions. And if we're able to mobilize international support, I think that's a very powerful tool. On the issues that have come up so far, the technical issues that have come up so far, they're not significant enough to justify blowing up the deal, but at the same time, I wouldn't ignore them. I think they have to be raised and discussed.
Let's talk about another category. There hasn't been a per se major violation of the agreement, but I think that most reasonable people would agree that there's been major disappointments. For example, the ballistic missile testing. You and I have spent a lot of time in the weeds talking about this, and if my wife was moderating this, she would be telling me that I'm going to don't geek out here and have everyone nod off. But the reality is that most people, Gary, would see the ballistic missile tests and the frequency of those ballistic missile tests as Iran's nuclear program or bad behavior continuing and threatening behavior. Obviously not a per se violation of the agreement, but certainly not behavior that you would like, given your nearly lifelong history of fighting on these issues on behalf of the United States. How do you deal with the ballistic missiles?
So, as I said, I think Iran is going to carry out a whole range of activities outside of the nuclear sphere that we don't like. And testing ballistic missiles is one of them. I mean, we agreed to modifications of the UN Security Council resolution that gave Iran a pretty good argument that there were no prohibitions on them conducting ballistic missile tests, and they've taken advantage of that. Of course, they were testing ballistic missiles even when they were banned by the UN Security Council resolutions. So in that respect, there hasn't been a significant change. The one footnote I would make, though, is that I don't consider Iran's ballistic missile program to be solely a reflection of its nuclear ambitions. For a country like Iran that does not have an effective air force, these missiles armed with conventional warheads is one of their best means of threatening targets in the region. And if you listen to US military commanders, it's really Iran's ballistic missile force with conventional warheads that makes them worried because they're hard to defend against. And the rest of Iran's armed forces are not very impressive.
If I could, let's focus a little bit on the debate from the JCPOA and expectations that arose from that. And I think you made a very smart, wise comment that it's become part of the political fabric, which is always dangerous. You and I have remarked that these issues have historically been quite bipartisan, and obviously they've become more complicated as time has worn on. But let's talk about the domestic Iranian political scene, if we can. You talked about Rouhani and expectations that he has with elections about delivering full sanctions relief. What I find troubling about that is that under no circumstance was the JCPOA, really at the insistence of the Iranians themselves, designed to be, I call it a limited nuclear cooperation agreement plus maybe a little bit more. It did not address the many other issues from regional issues to terrorism, human rights. And as part of that, the sanctions easing was limited in nature, designed to reflect a partial agreement, if you will, of all the issues that are outstanding. Do you think that President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif got over their skis at home by promising a level of sanctions relief that really wasn't contemplated by the JCPOA? And how are they dealing with that?
It's hard to answer that question because I think part of Iran's complaints about the level of sanctions relief is just political theater, that they're trying to put pressure on the US and the Europeans to do more to convince banks to provide loans and finances. I think part of it probably is that they oversold the deal. And who knows whether they oversold the deal deliberately or they were promised things that they believed that turned out not to be true. I think it's very hard to answer that question. But I do think that there's an implicit assumption on the part of many supporters of the JCPOA that over the long term, the deal can help to strengthen moderate, pragmatic forces that want to lead Iran away from a revolutionary course of action and to improve relations with the U.S. and the West. I don't know whether that's true. I'd like to believe that there are such political forces in Iran, but so far I think they haven't been very effective. And my guess is that until the supreme leader dies or has to retire, you're not likely to see very dramatic change inside Iran. So to some extent, the JCPOA is a gamble. It's a gamble that over the period of time that the physical constraints are in place, 10 to 15 years, that'll be enough time for there to be political change in Iran, and at the end of that period, we'll be dealing with a country that isn't as hostile to the U.S. and U.S. allies in the region. But whether that gamble will pay off or not, I just don't feel confident I can make that decision. And as I said, I'm not particularly confident that the JCPOA is going to survive that long anyway.
Let me ask a similar question related to our domestic concerns. One of the things that Gary and I have dealt with is when you think about the sanctions that have been associated with Iran, I don't know if a hodgepodge is the right word. Matt Levitt, or Matt, if he's still here, a hodgepodge is the right word, because you can think of our sanctions as cones for terror here, for human rights violations, for terrorism and the like. And as part of that, we agreed to sanctions easing that didn't necessarily emotionally and always intellectually align with a nuclear agreement. So we eased some and didn't ease others because of the cones. How do we resolve that issue? Because, for example, we've taken sanctions off Soleimani and the IRGC, but at the same time, we think that they're the leading state sponsor of terror through the IRGC and Quds Force. How do we reconcile that at home and overcome sort of the political debate that's about that? Because I don't think any serious person would say that as effective as our sanctions result was, the cooking was a little bit messy at times.
So I think in the course of negotiations, I think we specified very carefully and clearly to the Iranians what they were going to get in terms of sanctions relief. Whether they misunderstood that or didn't fully appreciate what the limits would be, I can't say. In a perfect world, you would want to negotiate additional sanctions relief in exchange for changes in other areas of Iran's behavior, whether it's ballistic missiles or support for terrorism or whatever. But I don't have much confidence that we're in a position to do that. I mean, the next administration may try that. I think Kerry had some conversations with Zarif to see if there was some way to agree to limits on missile testing in exchange for additional sanctions relief. And that fell apart, I mean, presumably because there wasn't support for it back in Tehran. I think the next administration should take a shot at trying to get changes in other areas of Iran behavior that threaten us in exchange for sanctions relief. But again, I'm not too sure that's going to work out.
Is it possible, maybe I am looking at a very jaded view of Washington, is it possible to adopt a sanction on Iran that fixes some of the hodgepodge that we talked about without infuriating Iran irrationally?
I mean, I think it really does depend on the politics. Who's elected president and then that person's interaction with Congress. Right now, the whole Iran sanctions debate in Congress has become completely partisan. There must be 15 or 20 different, bills in Congress that are being crafted to impose sanctions or to otherwise obstruct the nuclear deal, and all of them are being pushed by the Republicans, and Obama's not going to let any of them pass. I would love to see a more bipartisan, approach emerge after the election, and I think there are areas where, as you say, there could be some rationalization of sanctions so that it would be more effectively applied against those areas of activity that are not covered by the JCPOA. But whether Washington can bring itself to truly act in a bipartisan way on this issue or any other issue, I just don't know. It's too early to tell, I think.
Because I think in some ways it speaks to the fragility of the agreement that you described, that we are in a place now, both from a policy perspective and perhaps from a political perspective, that even if we saw egregious behavior by the IRGC, for example, related to terror and the like, we would have a very difficult time adopting a sanction without being tangled in the politics, both domestic politics here and domestic politics in Iran on the nuclear agreement. I find that's a very uncomfortable place for any current president or future president to find themselves in.
I mean, I think it really depends on the event. If these IRGC Navy actions in the Persian Gulf lead to an actual incident, a conflict, where people are killed, then I think that could very easily blow up the deal. So I think it depends very much on, what takes place outside of the four corners of the agreement, whether it reaches the point where it would jeopardize the agreement.
All right, one last question for me. I already asked one, but there's another one I want to get to. Is it a museum of enrichment? That's an inside joke between Gary and I. Gary and I would debate about the size and scope of what would be okay, if any, for Iran to enrich. And Gary came up with the term, I hope you're not mad at me for raising it, but the Museum of Enrichment, because Gary rightly said that the Iranians wanted to show their pride and their technical expertise, and they had invested a lot of money in enrichment, and there was always the issue of whether or not they should be permitted to enrich. And Gary coined a term called a museum of enrichment, showing that they could do it, but not much less, not much more. What's the size of that museum now, and what do you think? Tell me, characterize it now. I haven't heard that view from you in a while, and I'd be curious to hear it.
So, it's clear that for their nuclear power program, the Iranians don't need to have an indigenous enrichment capability. They can buy fuel like all other countries do, or most other countries do. The purpose of the enrichment program in Iran was to provide a cover for a nuclear weapons effort. And the question is, in 15 years, are they still going to be committed to having a nuclear weapons option? If they aren't, then they can have their museum of enrichment with very advanced centrifuge machines that they're working on now. If they're still committed to having nuclear weapons, then I think they will proceed to try to expand their enrichment capability. And as I said, that would pose, whoever is president then, that could pose a very difficult problem if we still have suspicions about Iran's nuclear intentions, if they comply with the agreement for 15 years. I think that's an unlikely scenario, but, in 10 years we can revisit that.
All right, fair enough. Let me ask another question from the audience. And Gary really is, on top of his knowledge in the Iran space, he's incredibly knowledgeable about North Korea. And here's a question that sort of joins the two in an interesting manner. Does the example of North Korea show us that sanctions, not donations, maybe donations too, sorry, that might have been a viewpoint point, are an ineffective way of containing states that desperately want nuclear weapons?
Yeah. So I think North Korea and Iran are so different that I view them as being really very separate cases. With North Korea, you have a country that is pretty impervious to sanctions. The only country that could really impose devastating sanctions on North Korea is China, and they don't do that for geopolitical reasons. And of course, the nature of the government in North Korea protects it from any popular pressure. Iran, contrary to North Korea, was much more vulnerable to sanctions because they depend so much on oil exports for their revenue, and just the nature of the government is more responsive to popular pressure. So I would say in the case of Iran, sanctions worked. They created leverage that allowed us to get what we were looking for, which were restraints on the nuclear program. In North Korea, it's much more difficult unless the Chinese change their position, and so far it doesn't look very likely that they'll do that. Last
question. I know Representative Engel is here. Can you discuss how Iranian-Russian cooperation affects the willingness of Iran to abide by the deal. Is that a net positive or negative? And I'm going to indulge and throw in one subcategory to this question, Valley's piece, Valley Nasser's piece, that suggested that one of the reasons that we should continue to aggressively have outreach to Iran, I'm trying to summarize a longer piece, would help to isolate Russia. I didn't agree with Valley's piece, but I'd like to hear your views on that and that question, please.
So, I mean, Russia and Iran are working together to save Assad, and they've been very effective. I mean, I think that they were forced to intervene because the support that the U.S. and the Saudis and Turkey and Qatar were giving the rebels reached the point where it looked like the Assad government would lose control over Latakia province. And the Russians and the Iranians were not prepared to accept Assad's defeat, and they intervened quite effectively to at least stabilize the situation. So, but I see Iran and Russia as operating not as close allies, but whenever there are areas where they have common interests, in the same way as we work with Iran when there are areas of common interest, like trying to defeat Islamic State in Iraq, or we work with the Russians. So I don't see what Valley talks about as an axis between Russia and Iran. I don't see that. I think there's no love lost between the Russians and the Iranians, and they work together when it's in their interest to work together. And you know, one more thing I would say about Valley's piece. Valley argues that we should lift more sanctions against Iran in exchange for them not giving the Russians military bases. But I don't think it's necessary for us to pay the Iranians not to give Russia, military bases. The Iranians themselves are not prepared to do that. And after the Russians boasted about using an airfield inside Iran to attack the opposition in Syria, the Iranians kicked them out. So I think the first rule of diplomacy is don't pay for something you can get for free.
I lied. One more question, since we were talking about pieces. The Javad Zarif piece and Adel's piece. What a fascinating opening of the doors in the region. Tell me what you think of your friend, the foreign minister, Zarif's piece, and your friend, Adel al-Jaber's piece in response.
So we all know that the Saudi-Iranian dispute has reached, very deep racial/religious levels, and obviously is not going to be patched up anytime soon. And of course, a lot of the conflicts in the region have taken on elements, or to some extent they're a reflection of that Saudi-Iranian rivalry, including Yemen, Syria, and so forth. At the same time, I don't worry very much about the two countries getting into a conflict because the United States Fifth Fleet stands interposed as the dominant military force in the region. So the Iranians are not going to attack the Saudis. The Saudis are not going to attack the Iranians. They'll continue to, to maneuver and to criticize each other using this very heated language, and the rivalry will, also, be reflected in the oil market. But I don't think it'll lead to conflict.
We had one more. This is a good one. I promise this is it because we have to get to Representative Engel. President Obama is expected to laud the nuclear deal in a speech at the UN Tuesday, but Rouhani will be in New York as well. Why aren't there any high-profile meetings between the United States and Iran this week? And what do you think is holding back each side? And I promise that's the last one, and I apologize, Representative Engel. We're moving on right now.
So, the constraint on high-level political meetings has always come from Iran, not from the United States. And it's because in politics inside Iran, the U.S., according to the Supreme Leader, is the great Satan, and I think he really means it. I think he believes that the U.S. is determined to destroy the Islamic Republic and to be seen as being friendly with the enemy that poses an existential threat to your country is not politically safe or wise.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all very much for the questions. Thank you, Gary. It's always great to be up here with you.
Thanks very much to Dr. Gary Samore and to Mark for a really good discussion. So I'm going to do a very brief introduction because Congressman Eliot Engel has been good enough to come here. He walked the last few blocks because the car wouldn't move, and he's got another engagement he needs to go to. He's the ranking Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He's a longtime leading congressman from New York, from the Bronx. He's a dear friend of mine. He's played a very active role over the years in something Gary Samore talked about, which was the creation of bipartisan coalitions to enact policy toward Iran, including sanctions toward Iran. So he gives us a unique opportunity from somebody in office to get a perspective on the thinking on Capitol Hill about Iran now and hopefully in the future. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Eliot Engel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And it's great to be introduced by Joe Lieberman. He's one of my heroes of all time. And I've loved him for years and years and years. And now he's my constituent, so I love him even more. But the moral clarity that he always has spoken with all these years is something that I wish more people could and would emulate. So I'm going to be brief because, unfortunately, I have a television interview I have to run to. And this is always crazy, as you know, in Manhattan on United Nations Week. But let me just tell you, we're here at a critical time, you know that. This is the first General Assembly after the implementation of the JCPOA. And as many of you know, I voted against the Iran nuclear deal. It wasn't an easy vote for a Democrat, but I voted against it. Because I was simply not convinced that this deal would keep a nuclear weapon out of Iran's hands. I was concerned that the deal would even strengthen Iran's position as a destabilizing and destructive influence across the Middle East. And let me just tell you very briefly, when Iran had no money, and Iran came to the table because it was hurting, the sanctions were hurting, they had no money. Their economy was in the toilet, their currency was worthless. They had no money to combat the unemployment that the youth have. They had no money for anything. They still found enough money to be the #1 sponsor of terrorism in the world. That's with no money. So on principle, this deal, which gives them so much money, is not something I could have ever voted for because we're handing them money. Imagine the destruction and the destructiveness that they can have with giving aid to both Hezbollah and Hamas. You know, they crossed the Sunni-Shia divide. They just, terrorist group, we're going to give you money, we're going to fund you. And they're largely, of course, responsible for the carnage in Syria today. So I couldn't vote for something that would give them so much money. And secondly, we were told that this agreement would prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. I've read the agreement several times. It does nothing of the sort. It postpones it for 15 years. It doesn't prevent it. So in the year 2030, which is now only 14 years, and soon it'll be only 13 years, Iran will essentially be a nuclear threshold state. So I couldn't support that, and I told that to the president when he spoke with me and asked me to support the bill because I'm the ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I told him that I couldn't do it, and those were the two reasons. I could give you 10 more, but those are the two main reasons. Iran's a grave threat to international stability. It's the largest state sponsor of terrorism, and even now, it continues to hold American citizens on bogus charges. They have more money, as I said before. It could help to inflict greater damage to Israel, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, our Gulf partners. And since the deal was implemented, I had no illusions about what Iran would do with its newfound wealth. This is a country whose leaders were chanting death to America, death to Israel, as the ink on the deal was drying. They couldn't even help themselves. 3 days later, they're yelling death to America, death to Israel. What kind of good faith shows that? They're doing ballistic missile testing, writing in Hebrew that Israel should be wiped off the face of the map. They did it in Hebrew. So it doesn't surprise me the way they're acting now. Iran is still a tremendous threat to the United States, to Israel, and to our allies around the world. And that's why I've sought to take the partisanship out of Congress's consideration of Iran-related legislation. The stakes are too high for partisanship to play a role. So our work now, with this deal in place, should be to fully hold Iran to its obligations, make sure they are fully implementing the deal. And one of the ways we can do this is to ensure there's a viable snapback of sanctions if Iran violates the deal. And that's why I'm saying that we should reauthorize the Iran Sanctions Act, or ISA, before it expires by the end of the year. And I believe Congress will do that. I work together with Ed Royce, who's the chairman, the Republican chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He's obviously the top Republican on the committee, and I'm the top Democrat. And we have more bipartisan cooperation on the Foreign Affairs Committee than any committee in the Congress, because foreign policy should be bipartisan. Differences should stop at the water's edge, and we need to hold Iran's feet to the fire. And Israel, near and dear to my heart, should not be a partisan issue. Should not be. Be bipartisan issue, bipartisan support for Israel, bipartisan support for foreign aid, bipartisan support for the MOU that was just signed with the administration. So we're in session for another week, and I think we should pass the Iran Sanctions Act, a reauthorization of it now, as soon as possible. I worry what it means when Iran is playing politics with global security, when Iran's leaders see us engage in political grandstanding instead of serious policy making. And again, politics should stop at the water's edge. So that's why I'm here today. I have a lot of things today, but when I was kindly invited to come here, I said I absolutely want to come here. Because since its founding, UANI has always played an important role in U.S. policy on Iran, and UANI is effective because it does not play partisan games. So I look forward to working with all of you to hold Iran's feet to the fire and work towards a safer future for generations to come. We need to be under no illusion about Iran. When they violate things, when they test ballistic weapons, when they support international terror, we ought to sanction them, and we are going to prepare further sanctions. We're going to watch them very, very closely. But again, we've got to act in a bipartisan manner to do that. So I'm going to say goodbye. I'm doing a live interview on MSNBC. But I wanted again to be here to compliment you and let you know that there are others like myself who are not going to play partisan politics. We're going to call it the way we see it. And the way I see it, Iran is no better now than it was a day ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. They create instability, and we have to not be delusioned and think that we have a deal that somehow or other is going to moderate them, because it's not. We've got to monitor them, we've got to watch them, we've got to work with our allies, and we should be under no illusion. So thank you for the work you do in focusing people's attention on this. We'll work together, and we'll continue to hold Iran's feet to the fire. Thanks so much.
Well done. Good luck. See you in the neighborhood. Thanks so much, Congressman Engel. Thanks for remarks that I would say are reassuring. I think it's been a really substantive, thought-provoking morning. It's hard to sum it all up, so I won't, but I'll just say that I was struck by the fact that we heard from people who were against the Iran nuclear agreement. We heard from people who were for it, but we didn't hear from anybody on either side who thinks that the agreement has changed Iran's behavior in any fundamental way. I mean, I think what Gary Samore said sums it up. This was an agreement that was transactional, not transformational. It was about the nuclear weapons. They got a lot in return that will, in fact, assist them in not being transformational. And I thought Gary Samore's, this is my words, sort of pessimism about the longevity of this agreement was particularly significant because both because he supported the agreement with open eyes, but also because he's such an expert and an experienced hand in this field. So there's a lot of work for UANI and all who are affiliated with us to continue to do. We have a couple of more panels that I think are equally substantive and with a remarkable range of people. Before the next one starts, which will be, I don't know, a little bit, somewhat after 1, UANI is about to break one of the fundamental rules that I learned when I first got into politics a long time ago, when somebody said to me, you must always know, however you interpret these words, that there is no free lunch. Today, there is a free lunch, and we're happy to provide it, and then we'll come back. There's an excellent panel, which will be moderated by Mike Makovsky with Ray Tyack and others, and then I'll be back at 2:30 with quite a diverse panel with Sheikh Khalifa, who's here from Bahrain, with Tzipi Livni, the former Foreign Minister, Justice Minister of Israel, and with, Radek Sikorski, former Foreign Minister of Poland. So all opinionated, all dynamic, and I will try my best to moderate them. In the meantime, have a good lunch. Thank you.